Sorry.
So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here online too. So Bermal, I will leave you to introduce Geneviève Pagé.
Hi again, everyone. So we will continue with feminist movement in Quebec. And Geneviève Pagé will present feminist movement in Quebec. I would like to introduce Geneviève. Geneviève is a scholar and activist, professor of political science at the University Quebec de Montreal. Her fields of research include feminist theory, political theory, and social movement, more specifically feminist and LGBT movement, and feminist pedagogies. Most of her research has been in collaboration with diversity of feminist groups in Quebec on topics such as reproductive justice, access to and alternatives to the judicial system, intersectional and anti-racist feminist governance, sex education, and sexual violence. Her previous research focused on creation, transformations, travels, and appropriation of theoretical concepts between feminist spaces. Geneviève.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Nilo, for the wonderful presentation. It's quite hard to speak right after you.
Yeah.
Especially considering the situation in Iran. It's very moving. And I'm shifting to something that's a little lighter, I guess, because not to minimize the violences that is being lived here. It's not on the same scale, let's say. And again, I organized my presentation in a way, not knowing exactly how familiar some of you are with Quebec. I wasn't sure what to expect in terms of your previous knowledge. So what I decided to do is to keep it rather short and maybe go deeper depending on your question. So use your question more because I wasn't sure what to expect. Also, what I've decided to do is to focus on how the threat to feminism has been changing in the past 20 years in Quebec. And so my point of entry will be nationalism, because in the recent year it's been shifting so much that let's say the right wing is being reorganized through the nationalist discourse in Quebec. And so I decided to do a little history of nationalism while doing a little history of feminism in Quebec. So doing both at the same time, kind of, and connecting them to see how they interact with each other over time, in order to understand what is going on right now in terms of the transformation of nationalism in the past 5 years, let's say. Okay, so just need to see my slide. Okay. So the structure of the presentation, as I said, will focus on the history of nationalism and feminism, and then we'll move to contemporary issues. And mostly I will name a few, which is not exhaustive, of course, but just to give you cues, and maybe we can go into some of them in more details, depending on what is of interest to you. So if we think about nationalism in Quebec, specifically, so to just give a broad understanding, before World War II, nationalism was very conservative. It relied on tradition. The Catholic Church was very involved in maintaining the social tissue of the Francophone communities across the country, not just in Quebec, but specifically in Quebec as well. And so it was the nationalism that was experienced was very much an ethnic nationalism focused on the survival of the French people and connected to the church, the Catholic Church, which was the main organizer of many institutions in Quebec. And so I've put a little quote. So one of the slogan was "La foi, la langue, la race." So this racial conceptualization of Quebecers or Francophones. Well, back then it was French Canadians, but so it was this, it was entangled with this idea of religion and this idea of language. It was all connected together. If we this type of nationalism started shifting in the 50s, where when most of the rural communities started going to the cities, and most of the French Canadians became factory workers instead of farmers, which had started way before that, but there was an additional transformation happening in the 50s. It was also at a time where the church was losing a lot of power, and labor unions developed really fast in the 50s, instilling a strong Marxist socialist influence in the Francophone communities, because most of the Francophones were working, were poor. The elite was still at that time mainly Anglophone, both the political elite and the economic elite. And as we move into the 50s, there's this shift happening where Francophones, the Francophone intellectual elite is claiming that they should be the political elite and the economic elite. So we see this shift happening in the 50s. And there's also a shift in how people how people identify. So we move from a French Canadian understanding of each other to a Quebec understanding of each other. So there's kind of a closing in on the Quebec space, and instead of kind of connecting with all French Canadians across the nation. So this happens in the 50s. On the feminist front, so pre-World War II and during the 50s, typical of, Occidental nations, there's three types of feminism that are present and competing with each other to a certain extent. The liberal, so the use of liberal arguments using reason to demand rights for women, this idea of universal rights, and they demand legal, civic, and economic rights, such as voting, such as being able to own property, such as being able to own a bank account, that kind of issues. But based on a liberal argument that women are people or women are individuals, and hence they should be recognized as such by the state. There's also, of course, the maternal feminism that's pretty conservative in some ways, where they use the higher morals of women to demand that they take part in public spaces or in decision in government on the basis that they know better, because they are the one raising children, classic maternal feminism, I guess. They're also involved in voting rights, but also social reforms, including prohibition of alcohol, including different including drug control, including violence against women. So these are some of the issues that are mobilized by this side of the movement. And there's also the workers' movement, so all the women that are in factories, so they organize as women or as feminists to a certain extent to defend women's conditions in the workplace. So it's pretty typical of Occidental nations at that time. But the workers' movement is pretty strong even then, although it doesn't necessarily recognize itself as feminist or doesn't use those labels. But there's a strong mobilization among working women to be able to work, to have equal pay, to have different shorter hours, and daycare, of course, which has always been an issue for working women. So in the 60s, again, I don't know how much of you know about this Quebec history. It might be basic for some of you, but I'm still going to go over it quickly so that everyone is more or less on the same page. So in this, it starts at the end of the 50s. We see what we call here the Quiet Revolution, where the state becomes to modernize itself, modernize its institutions. It becomes a welfare state by implementing a number of social programs. There's the nationalization of certain resources like electricity, like Loto-Québec, or different resources that they decide they will be controlled by the state. There's a growing demand on women's rights in the very liberal sense. And there's the secularization of institutions. So education becomes state-run. Before it was church-run. Same for health. So the hospital moved from Catholic hospitals to state-run hospitals. Same with politics. So we see a decrease of the influence of the church in politics, and unions as well, because before unions were also connected to religion. So the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, depending on your linguistic affiliation, were very involved in unions. So not always as conservative as we can portray. But so we see this change, right, in how the Quebec state is organized, and that involves decreased power for the church. This is also the end of the 50s and the 60s, where nationalism changes radically and becomes radical, promotes radical independence, in the sense that they develop this understanding of, as I said, this shift from French Canadian to Quebecers. So, and this idea that it's a different nation, that it should be run as a separate state. And in that moment, they are very inspired by decolonial discourses around the world. And so they connect primarily with Palestine, with the Cuban Revolution, with the Chinese Revolution, and they see themselves as part of a global movement to decolonize. And we can problematize what decolonization means in Quebec. And we can spend some time on it if you want. But this is how they frame it for themselves, right? So I don't want to, we can criticize it from where we are now, but the way they frame it for themselves is that they are part of this global decolonization movement. And in that sense, they make connections. They train with the OPP in Palestine, and they go to Cuba. They have connection with the Black Party movements. They really see themselves as part of this global leftist, progressive effort to control their own resources and manage their own land against the Anglophones or the imperialists or the US even. So there's this agglomeration of, like, you know, US capital and Anglophones are like one and the same kind of, you know, I mean, depending on who you read, you'll have a focus on capitalism or on imperialism or on the US stronghold on the economy or on the Anglophone and the political stronghold of Anglophones on the political spheres. There's this shift where language becomes class, and so we see this really this understanding of class, the class as being driven by language. So you are working class because of your language. And so the language you speak will determine what social class you are a part of. And although there are some obviously exceptions to that, it kind of, it reflects the reality of the Francophones being working class in general, except for the little intellectual elite. So some groups like the FLQ will use radical actions, including bombs, including different, including the kidnapping of political leaders, to mobilize and demand an independent state. At the same time, feminism changes a lot, because the same women that are part of the nationalist movement and the unions movement start to create different types of organizing or feminist organizing, and so they are women who are emerging from the nationalist movement, so they are very connected to it. And they are very connected to the leftist movement, which at the time is a yeah, it's communist, it's Marxist, it's Leninist. There's different factions, obviously. And so these women which are very different in who they are than from the previous feminist movement, who were part of the elite. These women are from working class, and so they try to connect with their reality, both or not both, but at the same time as their struggle for nationalism and their struggle for anti-capitalism. So I've put a little quote in French. So what it says basically is it's a quote from 1971 that says, but for women, what is the most important issue is it's women's liberation. However, we are very aware that our liberation is connected to the national liberation, and that's why we joined the movement. So they're trying to maintain this tripartite understanding of oppression with national oppression, women's oppression, and capitalist or anti-capitalist stance. The liberal movement still happens in parallel that, of course, and there's connection between them, but it's this revolutionary, they call themselves revolutionary feminists, are really coming out of the working class. Although as we move into the 80s, the social ascension, you can't say that in English, the social mobility, the class mobility of most Quebecers changes radically between 1968 and 1980. We see most of Quebecers who are coming from working class backgrounds become the middle class. And so although these women are originally from the working class, they quickly become part of the middle class because they are able to get an education, to get access to professional jobs, etc. And so we see this shift. So we can call them middle class feminists if we want, although their background is in working class understanding and conditions of living. So in the 70s and 80s, at the end of the 70s and 80s, we see as the nationalist movement becomes more and more institutionalized, and so they move away from radical groups who are putting bombs, etc., to more political parties like the Parti Québécois, so which are trying to assert control through official means of power, so political power. So as the nationalist movement is being institutionalized in political parties and takes a very large, wins the elections, for example, in 1976, and become the official leaders of the political institutions in Quebec. We see a lot of state feminism happening, right? Because the Parti Québécois is so connected. It's a political party that is coming from social movements. And so for the most part of the 70s and early 80s, I would say, it's still very much connected to social movements, to different social movements, including the feminist movement. And so there's a lot of cooperation between the Parti Québécois and the feminist movement, in the sense that they try to integrate some of their demands into their political platform. And there's a lot of women in the Parti Québécois who are very active, who are leaders of the party, and who are feminists. And so these women are crucial in creating legislative changes and implementing some of the kind of welfare state that is responding to women's demands. So we see different things over the years. So between, from the 70s and 80s to the years 2000, we see public daycare, we see pay equity, although we can question each of those and how they're imperfect, of course, parental leave, family planning, and change in patrimony rules. Different sections of the state will be transformed because there's such a strong connection between the some of the parties and the movements. It's also a moment where radical feminists are being absorbed by also the machine, I guess. And as they become professional, as they grow, as they have kids, etc., the individuals, they have to, work. And so even though they remain active as feminists, it's not being organized as much around radical action, around demand taking the streets, although it is for some issues like abortion, we still see radical organizing around this issue all throughout the 80s. And so, it's on and off, a mix of radical action, more lobbying and trying to convince the Quebec government to transform the laws and the welfare network. Fast or not. So throughout the 80s and early 90s, we see this kind of cohesion between the states, some, the less radical parts of the feminist movement, which allow for a number of changes to happen. However, there's a shift that happens in 1996 because there's a second referendum. So a second referendum for Quebec's independence. And throughout the mobilization for the second referendum, there is a really, really strong understanding of we have to create this new Quebec, and this new Quebec should be inclusive. And most of their campaigning, so the Yes campaign or the We campaign, is very is trying to be very inclusive of diversity. Again, although very imperfectly, but at least, on the surface, it is trying to promote an understanding of Quebec that is very civic based. So it's anyone that lives here, this is open to everyone. And we want to create this new society together with everyone that's here, except the natives. But that's, we can talk about the relationship with the natives throughout this period. If we want. But what happens is that we lose, or the Yes camp loses the referendum, right, in 1996 by 0.5%. And at the discourse of Parizeau, which was the leader of the PQ at the moment, so his speech at once we officialized the results, he says something that will completely transform the way nationalism will negotiate diversity. And so I've put the quote that is infamous. It says, I'll translate it for you. It's true we were beaten, we lost. But why? Why did we lose? We lost because of money and ethnic votes. And that is felt both by the feminist movement and by a lot of the communities that rallied behind the Yes campaign as treason, right? Because all of a sudden they're being blamed for the No campaign, and so this creates first, of course, after next, following the referendum, the nationalist movement kind of disbands, right? Because it's a big loss, and it's not, they put so much effort, and all of a sudden this is not a possibility anymore or it won't be for the next 20 years because we just had a referendum. We can't keep having referendums every 3 years, right? So there's a big reorganizing of the nationalist movement, and it loses a lot of potency. And what we see in the PQ and in more informal spaces is really a rise of neoliberalism. And so it's as if they gave up, right? They're like, whatever. And from that point on, slowly nationalism or the nationalist movement will start to rebuild, but it will rebuild in a very different narrative. and that narrative will incorporate some of the more, or will give more space to the right-wing content of nationalism, which was already there. It's not new in any way or form, but it wasn't the dominant narrative of nationalism in the same way. It was still there, obviously. So we see both a decrease in the investment in the welfare state and in the inclusion of different kind of bodies in the way we understand who Quebec is or who it's supposed to represent. So there's this reconfiguration of the threats to Quebec's identity, whereas in the past it was conceptualized as Anglo-Canadians were the main threat, and US imperialism was the main threat. And capitalism, to a certain extent, was the main threat. Although in '96 already capitalism was not really the core of the criticism. Starting in the second half of the '90s, the threat becomes immigrants. And so we have this complete shift into who is the other, where so it goes from Canadian and Anglophone institutions to immigrants. Based on language, so we associate immigrants with English, because even though most immigrants in Quebec are French francophone to some extent or speak some French, not all of them, of course, but most of the immigration is targeted towards French-speaking immigrants. Also, we associate immigrants with a return to religion, so they bring religion back into the public life, which is something that we try to move away. And we see this increase in discourse of the Quebec values, right? So what are Quebec values? And in that discourse, there's a big instrumentalization of women's rights. So Quebec's values are women's equality, which of course, when we're feminists, we know that this is not true, but it is framed as one of the core Quebec value, and immigrants are seen as a threat to women's rights. We have a stronger influence coming from France. So I said French, but it's confusing, right? So from France, namely in the conception of secularism. So what does it mean to separate the state and the church? We start seeing an increase in the way France conceptualizes what place should religion have in public institution. And of course, there's an increased denial of colonialism from Quebecers. So they kind of double down on, no, we were colonized, we're not colonizers, right? And we start emerging discourse that sees Quebec's the colonization by the French colonizer as less violent than the one from English Canada, right? And so we see the rise of this discourse as well. We see a series of events that clearly come to frame and reconstruct this understanding of nationalism, where Quebec's identity is pitted against immigrants. So there's the reasonable accommodation crisis, again, where we see immigrants' religion as pitted against women's rights. There's the Charter of Quebec Values, Bill 60. There's the Bill 62 in 2017 that demands adherence to state religious neutrality. And I put it a quote of the bill because it is telling in my sense. So in the preamble to the bill, it says, under the Act, personal members of public bodies and certain other bodies, I can't see it, as well as elected persons must exercise their function with their face uncovered. In addition, persons who request a service from such a personal member or person must have their face uncovered when the service is provided. And so it's not only targeting the providers of services. It means that if you want to access public services like going to the hospital or going to school, you must have your face uncovered, which of course targets directly people wearing, now the name in English I might get wrong, but the hijab or the full face veil. So this is really the shift in how this becomes legalized, because this is something that's been building since 1996, but it becomes the official discourse of the state, regardless of who is in power. Throughout these different bills that are being presented, contested. Not all were adopted, so the Charter of Quebec Values was not adopted, but the Bill 62 was adopted, and Bill 21, which you might be more familiar with because it's more recent, and it's still in the daily, it's still an ongoing debate. Was adopted. And the Bill 21 bans civil servants, judge, police officers, teachers from wearing religious symbols altogether. So that includes just the covering of the head with a veil, of course, which is, we know who is being targeted. And so it's really this right-wing shift in nationalism that's being growing, and is now the official the way the state itself is. So it's not just a movement or an activist, demand. It's being implemented in the state. So I've said most of this already, but the reconfiguration of nationalism has been increasingly anti-immigrant and racist, pitting white Quebecers against others redefined as immigrants, of course. Who are seen as a threat to French or Quebec survival. So the survival of the French language is being threatened by these immigrants who are coming here with their religious background, and they want to impose their values, and it's all this problematic discourse. And we reconfigured secularism as a core identity, which was not a core identity even in the 50s and 60s, when there was a separation with the church in terms of institutions. So the presence of the church in institution, that shift was not at all was not very strongly associated with secularism, or definitely not with the kind of secularism we are talking about today. It was in collaboration. And most of the church were still very involved in many of the whether it was education, there were still private school. We still have private school, religiously grounded private school. And the same with the nurses. Yes, slowly we were training nurses in schools rather than through apprenticeship and in religious communities. But it was a collaboration, and it wasn't. Although people were drastically quitting, not going to church and denouncing their connection with the church, it wasn't this conception of secularism, right? There's a rewriting of history that happens at the end of the 90s and early 2000 to say that this is what we did. We kicked out the church, and now it's trying to come back through immigrants, right? So this discourse of anything religious is a step backward, and we have to uphold to keep our identity. We have to refuse anything related to religion whatsoever. Of course, completely oversighting, not looking at how, for example, Native people understand their religion, how it connects to their way of living, etc. So what happens? So at the same time, the feminist movement has been going through ups and downs, right? So and the separation with the nationalist movement is being slowly So the feminist movement slowly separates from the nationalist movement because of the way the nationalist movement is evolving. Although some individual in the feminist movement will, like individually, a lot of feminists will still identify as nationalists. They can't, they don't want to collaborate with the official national discourse anymore because of the way it's being rebranded and reframed. And we see a lot of double discourse going on in the feminist movement where they're like, well, we don't want this nationalism, right? We want to keep alive our idea of nationalism and have this hope that we can come back to this leftist, inclusive, kind of decentralizing nationalism, while parting from the nationalist movement who are growing in power. And so this leads us to the current situation where after the different bills that we've seen and the bill 21, the current government is pushing more and more and more on secular bills to marginalize Muslim women mainly, but also immigrant women in general. And the feminist movement is very aware of this right now. Like it took some years, right? It took some years, it took some debates inside the movement during the 2012, 2013. There were big debates among the feminist movement during the États généraux du féminisme, the general state of feminism, which lasted for 2 years. From people from all over the province came and talked together. What are our goals? And we saw in this moment a shift from a universalist understanding of feminism to an intersectional understanding of feminism, which was not accepted unanimously. That created a lot of tension in the movement. But at the same time, the immigrant women or racialized women were very involved in this process and in alliance with some of the leaders of the feminist movement, the white feminist movement. And in a way, we can say that the intersectional side won, so if you want, the internal feminist debate, and the feminists who were still universalist kind of quit the movement. And however, they quit the movement and went to the political leadership. And they started, and they were mostly white women who had a lot of political power, a lot of access to newspapers, a lot of access to the political elite. And they started to speak a lot more with the political elite and fuel that nationalist movement in the political elite. And so we see an increase in the following 2013, an increase in the instrumentalization of women's rights to justify the nationalist agenda or the anti-immigrant agenda or the right-wing agenda, depending on how we want to, which part we want to focus on. And this is, so what, you know, people have theorized as feminine nationalism. And we see a continuance of that in this year, last year, this year, where this is being just furthered. And more the feminist movement is at loss as to how to counteract this trend to increase the right-wing and fascist agenda in the government. So I've put a number of other bills that you might know of. So Bill 94, which will extend to all school workers, so not just teachers. So the people who do after-school programs and all of that have to be free of religious symbols. The Bill 9, which extend that to daycare workers, and the last, the other big one is the Quebec Constitution Act, which was presented in the fall, Bill 1. which is clearly in the line of instrumentalizing women's rights to advance right-wing and fascist agenda. And so we see this discourse of we have to prioritize women's rights over all other rights, as if women only have issues with inequality with men, right? Their other inequalities are not part of who they are, right? So that's part of the current challenges. I think I have more on this though. There's other current challenges for the feminist movement. Of course, the increase in masculinist influence on society. So the TikTok influence, the misogyny that's being affecting the younger generation a lot more. And so we see a real separation between what young boys and young girls think. So there's a polarization of how young men or boys see the world and how young women or girls see the world, which is leading to a lot of conflict in high schools and even elementary schools in terms of understanding how to act with each other. Increase in homophobia and transphobia, of course, you've probably seen. So this is kind of a different source, although it hasn't yet fully connected with the nationalist movement, but it's just a matter of time, if you ask me, before the increased misogyny from the masculinist influence and homophobia and transphobia are connecting to the right-wing fascist racist movements that are closer to power. There's an increase in conservative right-wing presence on different issues, so abortion, trans rights, sexual education, so a questioning of should we have sexual education in schools, and international issues, which are lived at home. So we can name a few: Palestine, the war in Iran, and U.S. influences in general, because of course what's happening in the U.S. has kind of creates a ripple effect in Quebec, where people are worried and kind of tend to say, well, we have to, do our own things. And sometimes it means less progressive policies. So because what's interesting also I wanted to say about because I don't know, the demand was that we talk about current issues in terms of the feminist movement in Quebec. And I guess the last thing I want to say is that because so many of these attacks have been coming from the legislative branch, it forced the feminist movement to kind of turn back to the government as as an enemy, which it hadn't been that much in before the years 2000, right? It was sort of an ally that we were critical of, that we would contest, that we would but we would work with them, and they would listen to the feminist movement to some extent, and they would try to include some of their demands all the time. And now we're really in a place where the government is full on anti-feminist, in a way that the feminist movement is not able to respond because of some of its connection to the political elite have left because they disagreed with the feminist movement was going. So the struggle has been displaced in the legal arena and in the political arena in a way that we hadn't seen in a very long time. And the other space for this battle is social media, which is also not a space that is where feminists have a big voice in general. Not that it's not there, of course, but it's not a space where the message is able to really to come in dialogue with what is going on in a way that is, I don't want to say it's not a meaningful impact, but it's being completely submerged by the way social media is organized and how, it's individualized and it's not collective action and it's not creating communities, it's creating online communities which are not able to create the same solidarity connections. So it makes for a pretty dim outlook. But I'm going to stop here and maybe just leave you. We can't really see the So it was just this weekend, right? It was March 8th, International Day for Women's Rights. And it was very telling that, I can't see, the Bernard Drinville made a speech where he was like, I'll translate for you. So in this, in today, March 8th, the International Day for Women's Rights, I want to speak directly to young women in Quebec and to my daughter and those that will follow. Don't ever let someone tell you that a job is not for you, and it's the same person who demands that people need to not wear their scarf to work in the public sector, right? So there was this meme that was going on where it was a good. So there we go. I can end here and maybe go in details in terms of what you would like to know more about, because I feel like it's very general, very, and we can go into different subsections of this, but I wasn't sure of what was of interest to people. So this is.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you stop sharing the screen?
Yes.
So I will
Yes.
put everybody on the screen.
Of course.
That was fantastic, by the way. One of the clearest presentation of the feminist movement in Quebec I've ever heard.
Thank you so much. So we have a question in chat. Nabia want to ask a question. Nabia, can you please ask your question?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So unfortunately, it was too interesting, so I have too many questions, but I'll try to keep it brief. Okay, so Geneviève, I was wondering, as you were talking about kind of the emergence of this feminist middle class as a result of socializing and kind of like the welfare state, it sounded to me like this dialectic that, you know, through having socialized services and through having more social programs, this radical socialist movement kind of created its own kind of enemy, basically, by raising everyone's living standards and eventually creating a bourgeois class, which ended up, you know, cutting it at the knees. So I don't know, I thought that was interesting, like how that, you know, there was an emphasis on social programs, but not like a kind of a control on the top for like I don't know, to keep like a rank and file sort of recallable responsible kind of you know, top. I don't know if you see what I mean. Like there was like a movement upward, but there wasn't like the garde-fou on top for anti, you know, for what happened later, you know, like the institutionalization and the kind of the bourgeois kind of turn of Quebecois nationalism. So I thought that was interesting. The second question, I was wondering, or rather, like my first one was an observation, but the second one is a question. Do you have any idea of why racial minorities and immigrants were not really kind of sold on the independentist movement, considering it was such a radical, such a, you know, like you know, it seems to me that like working class migrants would have been pro independence. And so I'm wondering if the failing of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to kind of address labor movements in a way that reached, you know, many different racialized communities did not end up like biting the the movement itself in the, you know, and kind of like, oh well, you ignored us this whole time. I don't know. I'm wondering if this was the case or not. And then my third question is more about contemporary feminisms and you know, what has been happening since, you know, 2008 basically in Quebec with the Bouchard Taylor thing. And I was wondering, in your opinion, why these bills 21 and the following ones were not translated into basically like a labor movement. I'm wondering why the struggle is stuck at the, yeah, it is my research topic. That's why I'm like very yeah, so but yeah, I'm wondering why they're restricted to the legal framework, as you've mentioned, and then, the social media battle, where both are kind of focusing on, the experience of marginalization, of discrimination, etc. But it's not really narrated as a like as an attack on both our public services and also on workers' rights, since the la clause dérogatoire is kind of, sorry, I forgot the translation, is kind of overrides, legally overrides unions and workers' rights, which is a very Duplessis thing to do. And I don't know why, like the white left, I guess I would say, or whatever, the union, etc. I don't know. Is there reaction on this front, or is Islamophobia too deeply ingrained to translate this issue in these terms, and we're stuck in this, between the liberal feminism, civilizational feminism, and also kind of this anti-racism that is also not translating it into a labor issue and is focused on personal experiences of marginalization. Like in from what I'm seeing, I don't know, it's my opinion, but I was wondering if you had comments on this. Sorry for the breadth of, but it's your fault. Your presentation was too interesting. So
Well, thank you. I'll take it as a compliment then. So were racial minorities sold or not sold by the campaign for the referendum, right? That was your first real question. The first one was a more of a comment, I guess, or I didn't hear a question, but I can talk about it if you want. But it's a good question. I think so. Why did the referendum or the yes camp of the referendum not convince people of different racial background to vote yes? And then I'm going to go with, so this is not scientifically driven. Okay, this is just my opinion based on my experience back then, but since then, and my talking with different people who were part of the yes campaign and were racialized. And so there's different elements. So some of the communities were sold. So some of the communities were part of the yes campaign. And this is why it felt like treason when that speech was made, and that created a refusal to ever engage again in this kind of process, because they felt completely instrumentalized by the yes campaign. All of a sudden, you lose and you like point a finger and blame. And part of course, not all racialized communities or diasporic communities were I think we have to understand also that if you're coming from a place of political unrest and you moved here, or your parents moved here, and you've seen the political unrest happening in different countries, this kind of change is harder to I think a lot of people wanted security in a way that the No campaign could provide security. They came to Canada, they didn't come to Quebec. They're not as attached to this identity, although the way they did connect was through some of the socialist influence, right? So because the nationalist movement was promising more welfare program, more of a welfare state, to maintain the welfare state in a way that wasn't happening in Canada at the time, some communities were very involved in the Yes campaign because of those reasons. Yet others were more concerned about, because not all immigrants also, like they're not a monolithic block, right? So there's so many different realities and some wanted to be able, they feared that the imposition of French was going to get worse, right? So if it's already, I mean, we see it even without the referendum, right? But back in the 90s, this idea that you have to speak French and that you have to learn it quickly to be able to find a job, I think a lot of them feared that it would be even harder because it would be different, and they couldn't move as easily to Toronto or Vancouver or find a job in different places in Canada. And most people who immigrate, they immigrate to Canada. They don't immigrate to Quebec, right? Some don't even have an understanding of this is people from the Francophone world do understand that Quebec is Francophone, but a lot of people, they don't understand the language politics before they get here. They get here and they're like, woo, okay, this is happening. Wow. And they kind of got in. So I think you're right. I think they really tried to have this discourse of being open and etc. But you're right. They didn't, and I think we have to see also the union as, so the shift I described in the feminist movement where it's coming from working class and it's moving into the middle class. This happened with the unions as well, right? So most of the unionized jobs became middle class jobs and jobs that were not necessarily that available to immigrants. And the jobs available to immigrants, like factory workers, were not starting being delocalized, right? So a lot of, for example, the textile industry, right? So a lot of it moved from you go to work in a big textile factory and you sew all that you saw. All day, and then you take stuff at home and you sew in your little 2-bedroom apartment, and you're paid by the piece, right? So the way to same thing with so the way the unions are able to reach the poorer segment of the working class is still very problematic even today. Like the people who are unionized are middle class. And so the unions themselves lost connection with the real workers, I believe. But they unite teachers, they unite nurses, they unite white collar workers, like lower white collar workers. But they have a hard time getting into spaces that are really exploitative, right? So the farm workers or the temporary workers are not unionized, or they have associations, they have different groups to collectively organize, but they're not part of the big unions in Quebec, which are still predominantly very white and more middle class. So yeah, there's a failure, I believe, on the part of the labor movement to keep in touch with the real world. Well, I don't want to say real versus unreal, but you know what I mean? The people who really need the unions are not unionized, because the people who are unionized already have those benefits, right? So yeah, I think there's a failing on part of the labor movement to really connect with marginalized communities. And that probably led, you're right, it's an interesting understanding of the failing of the referendum in part, because the unions were very pro separation, right? Pro yes camp. So yeah. On where is the labor movement on Bill 21? Very good question. I'm so happy you asked that. This is such and it's again this framing, right? And you've mentioned it, and you've mentioned it very well, where it's being framed, it's this hierarchy, right, of rights, where labor rights are being subsumed to women's rights, understanding that the women's rights are very narrowly understood as and this understanding that by default, if you're wearing a scarf, you're not free, right? So this right. So it's a very good question. I don't know where they are and why they're not involved. I think it's the same answer, right? The labor movement is white middle class. it's not where these women are. I mean, yes and no, right? The daycare workers are unionized, mostly, not all. The teachers are unionized, but it's a minority. So for the teachers, for example, it was a minority of women who were of the Muslim faith in the teachers movement. It's different for the daycare movement because they're a big part, at least in Montreal, and that's another issue, right? Montreal versus the rest of Quebec. So it's a good question. Where are the unions in the Bill 21? I don't know. I don't know, and I don't know why they're not more present. But I believe it's because the structure is done across Quebec, right? So the way the unionizing happen is it's not locally, well, it's locally and across Quebec. But as you go up the hierarchy, and who decides on what campaigns will take precedence and what resources are going to be allocated to defending this or that community. Probably there's something happening also with the Montreal versus rest of Quebec that I've seen in the feminist movement so often, where it's racism is this Montreal thing, right? Muslim, it's this Montreal thing. It doesn't happen here. We don't have immigrants here. We don't, everyone's white here. And I'm like, where are the natives in your area, right? So this understanding of like, oh, this is a Montreal problem. It can happen in many cross Quebec structures as well. So I don't have definite answers for you, but I hope it helps you. Say, can I follow up with a comment? I don't know how many other people want to talk, so I'll let you.
Yeah. Yes, please. Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna try to embrace all of these layers.
I'm so sorry. I'm interrupting you, but Nia wanted to add something about
comment, yeah.
Yeah, so please let's go with that, and then I will turn you back. Yes, Nia, you can follow up.
Okay, thank you. I just
I'm
wanted to
sorry.
say, it seems that the labor unions have reacted. It's just that the government is ignoring them. So they did oppose these bills, and they did see it as an attack, but the government is able to ignore them because of the non-withstanding clause, which I'm wondering why it's not like sending alarms across the board. It was more of my comment, but thank you again for your answer.
Yeah, just maybe does everyone know what the non-withstanding clause is? So the government, in order to prevent scrutiny on this bill, because it's probably legally in contradiction with the Canadian Charter of Rights, right? So it's clearly contravening to equal rights for Muslim women in particular, but not just. And so what the Quebec government, we have this provision in the Canadian legal system, it's called the non-withstanding clause, where you can, for 5 years, you're allowed to implement a law that's discriminatory because for higher purposes. So it's kind of like, I don't have the legal writing in front of me, but it's this idea that temporarily we can not look at whether this is discriminatory or not, because if we did, how can I explain this clearly? God. So it's kind of saying, notwithstanding the discrimination that this is creating, this bill will is needed to secure other rights. Okay, so it's really this pitting of rights against rights. And the idea is to protect women's rights again, but not looking at what other discrimination this is creating, right? So it's this clause that is happening and that has been, so is it clear for everyone? So it's supposed to be temporary, and it's supposed to be for exceptional cases, but more and more we see that as being used by different governments, not just the Quebec governments, but also against trans people in Ontario and against, so there's different instances where this is more and more being invoked to justify discriminating, right? So this is the first instance where it's been upheld and et cetera, and it's still in the courts whether, so the Supreme Court, so technically you can't even evaluate whether this law is discriminatory. So it's kind of saying we will take this law out of the evaluation of whether it's discriminatory because we needed to secure other rights. It's supposed to be temporary. It's been more than 5 years. It's not, yeah.
Yeah, but please, Christian, I need 2 minutes more. Okay, we have question, please. Let's go.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much. I was born in Ontario, but I actually can relate to a lot of that conversation, that whole Quebec story. Also because I grew up in this time that was quite feminist, and then it deteriorated in my face, and somehow I ended up in a neoliberal university, and I was very, very confused how I was supposed to implement this in the life that I had envisioned through the 90s and 80s, seeing my mother excel through her own education as an engineer, as a Latin American woman in Canada, and do so well. And also my father, who came here as an immigrant and also did so well. So I'm wondering, and they did exceptionally well. You know, they created so much beauty in this middle class section of society that seems to bloom very intellectually, I think, even as feminism, even though it's not very good. Anyways, so I was wondering, so I'm only going to say Montreal because I'm not connected quite with the rest of Quebec, but from my knowledge of just like the landscape, I see a lot of matriarch in it. Like, for example, like when I see the churches, I see a lot of them are about like Mary, Mother Mary, like more than I see in Ontario that's like more Protestant. And like that there's sort of a disconnection between like what is considered like a movement towards like more freedom or more like relation to the female experience. Like, for example, like for me, like for what's coming to me all the time is like bleeding. Like, why am I put in a position where I have sexual liberation, but not put in a position where I can just openly like assume that like a quarter of my month is like no sexual freedom, nothing, right? And I can't say that in public, right? And but something that could be in relation to a lot of like sacred values that are sort of like hidden or like in a lot of different societies. So I was just wondering, like, how do you see like kind of like an overlapping of these frameworks, like not distinguishing them. So not distinguishing like all the different world movements and all the different like religious aspects or state aspects, but just that kind of like in Montreal, like how would you feel or what do you relate to what would be able to be the next step in our kind of discovery of ourselves to get this thing going into like this future where there's so much exceptional work in Montreal. Like I see like amazing art shows depicting longer term histories, and I see a lot of food activism, which I relate a lot to females.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Like more like a visioning, like not like a separation of like state or whatever, but more like a kind of like a universal concept of like because I can see like in Montreal, it's a very, in my comparison, it's a very maternal. I feel it's a very maternal place, and I see a lot of women able to adhere to this kind of female like relationship to themselves, like instead of like becoming like more patriarchal, which I see more like in Ontario. So I'm just wondering, like, disregarding kind of like all of the frameworks, like how would you like to see like this all the work that's been done, even though it's in layers, even though it's contrasting, it's all still there. Like how would you like to see it sort of bloom or manifest into like a future where we don't have this patriarchal dominance and we're able to pursue these aspects of our society that we keep erasing, like reproduction rights like domestic respect. Things, yeah. So like basic feminist parts.
I think for me, the key is solidarity. Like it's connecting to each other. Whether, so yeah, because I think that's where the strength is. I believe the connecting to each other, like among women and non-binary and trans people, because and connecting like on a personal and emotional level. I believe that's where the strength is and the you can't sustain a movement if you don't have relations with people. So you need to be able to trust people and construct things together. And that only happens when there's when you have confidence in one another and yeah, trust. And so if you ask me, that's the core of the ethos, if you want, is through connection across differences, a connection without negating the power struggles that are the power dynamics that are within the movement, but connecting through those power struggles, but also trusting that we can work on them through coalitions without yeah, I would say that for me is the future.
We have another question, and it will be our last question, friends, because we already run out of time. I also have many questions, but Geneviève, I will ask you in person because I don't have time to do that. I'm okay. Okay, Denise, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this very explanatory and helpful presentation. Since we are out of time, I'll just get to the chase. Is there any connection between the insoumise movement in France and Quebec, various like contemporary Quebec feminist movements? Since like we seem to be receiving the secularism and Islamophobia from France. Maybe could there be an influence in the resistance part is my hopeful question.
I think there is among racialized feminists, which again is a big category, which is very problematic to use, but to be short, I think some women in the feminist movement are connected to their counterparts in France, but we're constantly in this idea, or maybe it's my naivety, but we keep year after year, I keep thinking that, oh, what happens in France is not going to happen here, right? Different context, we can't go that far. Come on, like I'm an eternal optimistic. So, and I think so this idea that it's still better here than it is in France is somewhat present, although I think it's being more and more criticized, especially in the last 5 years, with these legislative changes, and the realization that even for a feminist, racialized feminist or a feminist of color who are being active in the movement, I mean, there's, I've talked about big treason, but there's little treasons, right? Every day, sometimes white feminists do say things that are problematic, or and so there's little and big treasons that happen, and so there's this. I think I've heard a lot of people who are among racialized feminists or feminists of color who are like connected to what's happening in France, but I don't see it impacting the feminist movement as a whole for some reason. And I believe that might be because we think we're better, which is a problem, because it's just, I think we think we're better than the feminist movement in France, right? Oh, we've done the thing with intersectionality. Yeah, we're done. They're still on universal feminist, right? So we have this weird relationship with the feminist movement in France where we think in Quebec we're better. And so I don't think we take these threats seriously enough. And so there's not this big push to connect with organizing, radical organizing that's happening elsewhere, and we should learn from. So that would be my take quickly in a 2-minute response. But thank you for the question, because yeah, there is resistance and experience we should learn from elsewhere, namely in France, because it's, as you said, the way it's being framed is so close to the way it's being framed in France that clearly we should. But we think we're better. I think that's the answer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you everyone online too. We will be back at 1:15 with the talk by Florencia from Argentina. So we have 30 minutes for lunch. Thank you so much again, Geneviève.
You're welcome.